So, first Sunday after Christmas, and I'm wondering, did anyone here get clothing for Christmas this year? Anyone? Show of hands? Sweaters, socks, robes, shirts, something like that? Okay, good. That's great. But growing up, I thought that clothing was the most boring gift you could possibly receive at Christmas. And it always seemed that I had this pair of super scratchy dress socks that I never wanted to wear crammed into the bottom of my stocking. And sure, this was a practical gift, but as a kid, really disappointing. Socks just don't scream Christmas magic in the same way that like a Nintendo or a PlayStation would. But of course, now that I'm older, I kind of get it. A good pair of socks, a nice robe, they're more than just a gift. It's kind of a gesture of care, It says, I want you to be warm. I want you to be comfortable. I want you to feel cared for. And there's something about being wrapped up, whether it's in a favorite sweater or a favorite scarf, that just kind of feels like love. And that sentiment, I think, is not far off from the image that we heard today in our reading from Isaiah. He has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. So last Sunday, after church, Julia and I were invited to a surprise birthday party for a really good friend. And I have to apologize in advance to Julia. We have this deal where if I'm preaching and I mention her, I tell her in advance, and I didn't this time. So I'm sorry, Julia, for mentioning us in a sermon without getting your permission. But it's a good story, I promise. So neither of us, this party, the theme of the party was Casino Royale. And neither of us really knew what this meant at first. But a few hours before the party last week, we realized that this was code for dressing up like we were characters in a James Bond movie, which I know is just totally obvious. But we didn't have tuxedos or cocktail dresses on hand, so we needed to make a quick trip to H&M to find something suitable. Now, I really felt and feel conflicted about this because we try to avoid fast fashion because of the economic and environmental costs that are hidden behind the low prices. And compared to the experiences of our ancestors throughout human history, since the Industrial Revolution and the manufacture of clothing that started in the 18th and 19th centuries and the rise of fast fashion in the 21st century today, this has all totally distorted our appreciation for clothing, kind of much in the same way that like fast food distorts our appreciation of like a slow and deliberate meal. You see, in Isaiah's time, clothing held incredible significance. And our reading this morning discusses the gift of clothing, the garments of salvation, the robes of righteousness, garlands and jewels and crowns and diadems. So this portion of the book of Isaiah that we read from was written toward the end of the 6th century BC. It was when the people of Israel were just returning from captivity in Babylon. You see, a few generations earlier, the Babylonian armies had completely destroyed Jerusalem and sacked the temple, and as a tribute, Babylon took a significant number of people from Jerusalem and the surrounding countryside as captives, and they forced them to leave their homes in Judea and settle all the way back in Babylon. And while the exact number of people is kind of debated among scholars, what is clear is that the following generations of Jewish exiles living in Babylon mourned their homeland and prayed for their return and the restoration of the kingdom and the temple. So shortly before this passage was written today, the balance of political power in the ancient Near East shifted. And by 539 BC, Babylon itself was conquered by the Persian Empire, and King Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jewish people to return home, to rebuild their temple, and to restart their lives. This significant political shift marked the fulfillment of long-held hopes for these exiles. So in the words of later Isaiah that we read from today, these were written to encourage those people who, as exiles, now were returning and were facing this overwhelming task of rebuilding. They had witnessed the long-held hopes of previous generations of captives fulfilled. And as they were allowed to return from exile, this fulfillment came with the immense challenge of having to rebuild their lives and their community, basically from the ground up. So in response to this super complex situation, where hope and understandable despair are kind of mingled together, the prophet offers this image of a wedding celebration, where lavish gifts like robes and jewelry are bestowed upon a bride. Now, in the ancient world, garments like these symbolized honor, they symbolized dignity and renewal. They were unattainably grand for almost anyone in sort of everyday life. Common garments that people wore in day-to-day life were simple tunics, maybe linen robes, and most people in the ancient world would only have owned maybe one or two outfits. There was no H&M for them. And they would have to repair these as needed, to carefully wash them, make sure that they lasted for the majority of their lives. So the promise of like royal wedding finery would have been an extraordinary image of hope for a struggling people. This is a metaphor that paints a picture of divine generosity and grace. And God's promise is clear. You're not forgotten. God is wrapping you up. God is clothing you, not in shame or despair, but in salvation and righteousness. Think about that for a moment. God's not just patching up the holes in our old, dirty tunics. God is promising to give us something entirely new. It's as if God is saying, you don't have to wear these old clothes anymore, those clothes of shame or fear or guilt. I'm giving you something better. I'm giving you my love, my grace, my very life. Now that promise alone is beautiful. But Isaiah's words point us to something even greater, a fulfillment that transforms the metaphor of wedding garments into the reality of God's love for us in Jesus. In John's gospel this morning, we hear this cosmic announcement, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. Here, the gift of garments in Isaiah is transfigured into God's ultimate gift, God's very self. In Isaiah, these garments symbolize salvation and righteousness, pointing to God's desire to restore and honor God's people. But in John's gospel, the promise is fulfilled not as a metaphor, but as reality. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. So God's gift is no longer distant or symbolic, but embodied and personal, stepping into our lives through the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Now, at first, this might just sound like God is putting on humanity, like he's putting on a pair of socks or wrapping up in a Christmas sweater. But the incarnation is far more profound. God doesn't merely wear humanity, God becomes fully human while remaining fully God. In other words, the limitless God takes on the limits of our mortality. The timeless and eternal Word enters into time. The God who is beyond all things becomes small, becomes fragile, becomes one of us. So why? Why did God go about doing this? Well, you can imagine that theologians have debated this question endlessly. And I teach an entire 12-week course at the seminary on this very one topic. Some people argue that the mystery of God becoming human reflects God's intent to fix what is broken in humanity, but to do so from within. Others suggest that God becomes fully human to identify with humanity and to understand something of the human experience. Still others, like the Christian theologian Irenaeus, emphasize that God became human so that humanity itself might become godlike, highlighting how the incarnation draws together the human and the divine in Jesus and in us. And more recently, other theologians have explored how the incarnation calls us to justice and liberation, showing us God's desire to have solidarity with the marginalized and the oppressed. So together, taken as a composite, all of these perspectives reveal the multifaceted reasons for the incarnation, and they all point to a simple, enduring fact: God's desire for a deep and transformative relationship with us. So whatever the reason for the incarnation, it shows us that God desires to have a close relationship with God's creation, with you and me, and God is putting in the effort to make that happen. The good news is that God doesn't leave us to figure things out like this on our own. God is entering into the struggles of our world in our own lives and wrapping us up in love in the same way that God is wrapping God's self up in humanity. But here's the thing. We are often tempted to keep wearing our old clothes, the ones that are like our old ways of thinking, our old habits, our old hurts, that shame that we can't quite shake, those fears that weigh us down. Isaiah and John remind us today that we don't have to live that way anymore, that God is giving us something new, that through Christ we are clothed in salvation, wrapped up in grace, and invited to live as a new people who are made new in the here and now. So we're standing now on the edge of a new year, and maybe this is a good moment for us to take stock, to think about what old clothes are we still holding on to, and what would it look like for us to let them go, to put on hope instead of despair, to wrap ourselves in love instead of fear, and to step into that new identity that Christ is growing in all of us. So this week, as you put on your favorite Christmas socks, or you wrap yourself in that new Christmas scarf or that cozy new sweater, let's take a moment to remember that the Word became flesh for us, that God came from heaven to earth in order to know us, to love us, and to bring us close to God. And God is clothing us with grace. We don't have to wear the old clothes anymore. We don't have to stay in the darkness because the light shines. And that grace is still overflowing. And the love that came down at Christmas is still at work, wrapping us up, making us new, and inviting us to step into God's light. And that is a gift that never gets old. Amen.